My name is Maya Thornton, and 3 months ago I walked into a boardroom in downtown Chicago and announced to the shareholders of Hartwell Consulting that I was acquiring their company for $50 million. Sitting at the end of that table, his face completely drained of color, was Richard Hartwell, the man who 5 years earlier had laughed at my resume during a job interview and told me I'd never make it in this industry. He now reports directly to me. But let me tell you how a 23-year-old graduate who was publicly humiliated turned that pain into a consulting empire. Because this story begins in that same boardroom 5 years ago when I was just trying to get my first real job. I graduated from Northwestern University in 2019 with a degree in business analytics and a mountain of student loans. I'd worked 3 part-time jobs to pay my way through school, maintained a strong GPA, and done 2 solid internships at mid-sized firms. I wasn't exceptional on paper, but I was hungry and willing to work harder than anyone else. I applied to dozens of consulting firms around Chicago, and Hartwell Consulting was one of them. They were a respected mid-tier firm specializing in operational efficiency for manufacturing companies. About 40 employees, steady revenue, good reputation in the industry. I got called in for an interview on a Tuesday morning in June. I remember everything about that day. I wore my one good suit that I'd bought at a discount store. I carried my leather portfolio that my mom had given me as a graduation gift. I'd prepared for 2 weeks, researching the company, studying their client case studies, rehearsing answers to common interview questions. I was nervous but excited. This was my shot at starting my career. The interview was with Richard Hartwell himself, the founder and CEO, along with his operations director, a woman named Susan Chen. Richard was in his early 50s, expensive suit, confident demeanor, the kind of man who was used to being the smartest person in every room. The interview started normally. Standard questions about my background, my coursework, my internship experiences. Then Richard asked me to walk through how I'd approach a hypothetical client problem about supply chain optimization. I gave what I thought was a solid answer. I outlined a structured approach, mentioned some relevant frameworks I'd learned in school, talked about data analysis and stakeholder interviews. When I finished, Richard leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not a friendly smile, a condescending one. That's very textbook, Maya, very academic. But you clearly have no idea how the real world actually works. I felt my face flush, but I tried to stay professional. I understand I have a lot to learn, Mr. Hartwell. That's why I'm here. I'm a fast learner, and I'm willing to work harder than anyone else on your team. Richard picked up my resume from the table and actually laughed out loud. Worked 3 jobs through college. 2 internships at firms I've never heard of. Northwestern's a good school, but let's be honest, you're not Harvard material. And looking at this resume, I can tell you right now, you'll never make it in high-level consulting. You don't have the pedigree, you don't have the connections, and frankly, you don't have the strategic thinking skills we need. He dropped my resume back on the table. I'm going to save you some time and rejection letters, Maya. This industry isn't for people like you. Maybe try something more suited to your background. Administrative work, maybe operations coordinator somewhere. But consulting at this level, you'll never make it. The room went silent. Susan Chen looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. I sat there feeling like I'd been slapped, my face burning with humiliation. I wanted to cry, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I stood up, picked up my resume, and looked Richard Hartwell directly in the eyes. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hartwell. I think you'll be surprised what people like me can accomplish when someone tells us we can't. Then, I walked out of that boardroom with my head up, made it to my car, and cried for 20 minutes. That humiliation could have destroyed me. It should have made me doubt everything about myself. Instead, it did something else. It made me furious. Not angry furious, but focused furious. The kind of fury that burns cold and steady and fuels you through impossible obstacles. That night I made a decision. I was going to make it in consulting. Not just make it, but succeed at the highest level. And someday, somehow, Richard Hartwell was going to know that he'd been completely wrong about me. But first, I had to survive. No consulting firm would hire me after what happened. Word travels fast in Chicago's business community, and Richard Hartwell was well connected. I needed a different path. So I started freelancing. I reached out to small businesses, manufacturers, local companies that couldn't afford big consulting firms. I offered my services for almost nothing at first, just to build experience and case studies. I worked out of my studio apartment, putting in 16-hour days, teaching myself advanced analytics tools, studying every consulting framework I could find. My first real client was a small manufacturing company in suburban Chicago that was struggling with inventory management. The owner, a man named Tom Rodriguez, took a chance on me because I was cheap and hungry. I spent 3 months embedded in his operation, analyzing data, interviewing workers, mapping processes. I found inefficiencies that were costing him hundreds of thousands annually. I implemented solutions that increased his productivity by 30% in 6 months. Tom was thrilled, and more importantly, he referred me to 2 other small manufacturers. For the next 18 months, I built my reputation one small client at a time. I specialized in operational efficiency for manufacturing, the same niche as Hartwell Consulting, but serving the clients they considered too small to bother with. I learned more in those 18 months than I ever could have at a traditional firm because I was doing everything myself. Data analysis, stakeholder management, implementation, change management. I made mistakes and learned from them fast because there was no safety net. Have you ever had someone's dismissal become the fuel that powered your entire career? Let me know in the comments, because that's what Richard Hartwell's words did for me. Every time I wanted to quit, every time a client was difficult or a project fell through, I remembered him laughing at my resume, and I worked harder. By late 2020, I had a problem. A good problem. I had more client requests than I could handle alone. Small and mid-sized manufacturers were referring me to each other, and my reputation for delivering real results was growing. I needed to scale. So I did something risky. I took out a small business loan, hired 2 junior consultants who were recent graduates like I'd been, and officially incorporated as Thornton Strategic Solutions. We rented a small office space, built a simple website, and focused entirely on delivering exceptional results for clients that the big firms ignored. The pandemic actually helped us in a strange way. Manufacturing companies were desperate to optimize operations and cut costs. We were nimble, affordable, and effective. We could start projects quickly while big firms were tied up in bureaucracy. By the end of 2020, Thornton Strategic Solutions had 7 employees and $2 million in revenue. By the end of 2021, we had 15 employees and $5 million in revenue. We weren't huge, but we were profitable and growing fast. That's when I made a strategic decision that changed everything. Instead of competing directly with large consulting firms, I focused on building a specialized expertise. I brought in data scientists and developed proprietary analytics tools specifically for manufacturing optimization. I created a methodology that combined traditional consulting with advanced predictive analytics. Our clients weren't just getting advice, they were getting technology-enabled solutions that continued to deliver value long after our engagement ended. In 2022, I raised my first round of venture capital, $3 million from a Chicago-based VC firm that specialized in business services companies. That capital allowed me to invest heavily in our technology platform and expand our team to 30 consultants. We started landing bigger clients, mid-sized manufacturers with 50 to 200 million in revenue. The kinds of companies that were big enough to afford Hartwell Consulting, but were increasingly choosing us instead because our solutions were more innovative and our results were measurably better. That's when Richard Hartwell noticed what I was building. I started hearing through industry contacts that he was asking questions about Thornton Strategic Solutions. Who was this Maya Thornton? Where had she come from? How was she winning clients in his territory? I don't think he remembered me from that interview. I was just another ambitious kid he'd dismissed. But now I was becoming a competitive threat, and that got his attention. In early 2023, Hartwell Consulting tried to acquire us. Richard sent his COO to approach me with an offer. They'd buy Thornton Strategic Solutions for $8 million. I'd stay on for 2 years as a division head. Then I could leave with an earn-out. It was a decent offer financially, but it would mean working for Richard Hartwell. I politely declined and told them we weren't interested in selling. The COO seemed surprised. He said Richard would be disappointed. I just smiled and said perhaps we could revisit the conversation in the future, under different circumstances. What Richard didn't know was that I'd been studying his company carefully for over a year. I knew his client roster, his revenue, his profit margins, his team structure. I knew he'd been struggling with client retention because his approach was old-fashioned and his technology was outdated. I knew several of his senior consultants were unhappy and considering leaving. And I knew that his personal reputation for arrogance was creating problems with both clients and employees. Hartwell Consulting was successful, but it was vulnerable. So instead of selling to him, I started quietly recruiting his best people. I offered them better compensation, equity in my company, and a culture that valued innovation and collaboration instead of hierarchy and ego. Over 6 months, I hired away 4 of his senior consultants and 2 of his best analysts. Each one brought client relationships and institutional knowledge. Richard was furious, but there was nothing illegal about it. People leave jobs for better opportunities all the time. By mid-2023, Thornton Strategic Solutions had 60 employees and was on track for $20 million in revenue. We developed a reputation as the innovative upstart that was disrupting traditional consulting. We landed our first Fortune 500 client, a major automotive manufacturer that chose us over 3 larger firms, including McKinsey. That client success got us major press coverage in business publications. I was interviewed by Crain's Chicago Business and Forbes. My story, the bootstrapped consultant who built a tech-enabled firm from nothing, resonated with a lot of people. That's when serious private equity interests started. I was approached by 3 different PE firms about taking on growth capital or considering a sale. I wasn't ready to sell completely, but I was open to the right partnership. In September 2023, I closed a deal with a respected PE firm. They invested $15 million for a 30% stake, valuing my company at $50 million. That capital allowed us to expand nationally, opening offices in Detroit, Milwaukee, and Indianapolis. We were no longer just a Chicago story. We were becoming a regional player with national ambitions. Meanwhile, Hartwell Consulting was declining. They'd lost key people, their client roster was shrinking, and their reputation was suffering. Richard had always relied on his personal brand and connections, but the industry was changing. Clients wanted measurable results and innovative solutions, not expensive advice from consultants who looked down on them. By early 2024, I was hearing rumors that Hartwell Consulting was exploring strategic options. That's consultant speak, for they were looking to sell because they couldn't compete anymore. I waited. Patience is a weapon, and I'd learned to use it well. In March 2024, Hartwell Consulting officially hired an investment bank to run a sale process. They were looking for a buyer. The asking price was somewhere around $60 million, which I thought was high given their declining revenue. But I was interested. Not because I needed their company, but because acquiring them would be the ultimate validation of everything I'd built. The woman Richard Hartwell said would never make it would be buying his company. I submitted a letter of intent through my PE partners. Initial offer of $45 million, all cash, with the caveat that Richard would need to stay on for a transition period. The investment bankers came back saying Richard wanted $50 million and insisted on a clean exit with no transition requirement. He didn't want to work for whoever acquired his company. I smiled when I heard that and countered at $48 million with a mandatory 6-month transition period. Non-negotiable. They pushed back. I held firm. Eventually, they accepted $50 million with a 6-month transition, where Richard would report to the acquiring CEO. The due diligence process took 8 weeks. My team went through every aspect of Hartwell Consulting's business. Finances, client contracts, employee agreements, everything. Richard still didn't know who was acquiring his company. The investment bank kept the buyer identity confidential during due diligence, which is standard practice. I could have revealed myself earlier, but I wanted the moment to be perfect. That moment came 3 months ago in the same boardroom where Richard had humiliated me 5 years earlier. The closing meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. Richard would be there with his leadership team and lawyers. The acquiring company would reveal themselves and finalize the transaction. I walked into that boardroom at exactly 9 a.m. wearing a custom suit that cost more than my entire wardrobe had 5 years ago. I was accompanied by my CFO, my lead counsel, and a representative from my PE partner. Richard looked up when I walked in, and I watched the confusion cross his face. He clearly didn't recognize me at first. Then his operations director, Susan Chen, who was still with the company, went pale. She remembered me. She leaned over and whispered something to Richard. I watched him process it, watched his face change as he realized who I was. The nobody with the unimpressive resume who he'd told would never make it. And I was there to buy his company. I let the moment sit for a few seconds, then I walked to the head of the table and sat down in what had been his chair. Good morning, Richard. I'm Maya Thornton, CEO of Thornton Strategic Solutions. We're here to finalize the acquisition of Hartwell Consulting for $50 million. My voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of satisfaction. I believe we met once before, about 5 years ago. You may not remember the interview, but I certainly do. You told me I'd never make it in consulting, that I didn't have the pedigree or the strategic thinking for this industry. You suggested I try administrative work instead. The room was absolutely silent. Richard's face had gone from pale to red. He looked like he wanted to say something, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm, warning him to stay quiet. I continued. I want to thank you for that interview, Richard. Your words became the motivation that built my entire company. Every client I won, every person I hired, every $1 million in revenue, it all started with proving you wrong. So in a way, I owe you my success. I opened the closing documents. As part of this acquisition agreement, you'll be staying on for 6 months to ensure a smooth transition. You'll be reporting directly to me during that time. After 6 months, you'll receive your full payout, and you're free to retire or pursue other opportunities. I hope we can make this transition productive and professional. I looked up at him. Do you have any questions about the terms? Richard opened his mouth, closed it, then finally spoke. His voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. How did you do this? 5 years ago, you were nobody. You had nothing. I smiled, and it was genuine, not cruel. I did it by working harder than everyone else, by serving clients that bigger firms like yours ignored, by building better technology and better solutions, and by treating people with respect instead of dismissing them based on their resume. I did it by being everything you said I couldn't be. The papers were signed. The wire transfers were executed. Hartwell Consulting officially became a subsidiary of Thornton Strategic Solutions. Richard fulfilled his 6-month transition obligation, and to his credit, he was professional about it, even though it clearly killed him inside. He helped transfer client relationships, introduced me to key industry contacts, and trained my team on Hartwell's methodologies. It was awkward, but we both behaved like adults. On his last day, Richard came to my office. We hadn't spoken one-on-one during the entire transition except when absolutely necessary. He stood in my doorway looking older and tired. Maya, can I have a minute? I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat down, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he spoke quietly. I was wrong about you, completely wrong, and I was an arrogant fool to say what I said in that interview. You've built something impressive, and you did it the right way. I'm sorry. I looked at him and felt something I didn't expect. Not triumph, not vindication, just a kind of calm satisfaction. Thank you for saying that, Richard. I accept your apology. We both learned something from this experience. You learned not to underestimate people, and I learned that the best revenge isn't proving someone wrong, it's building something so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. He nodded, stood up, shook my hand, and walked out. I haven't seen him since. Here's what I learned through all of this. First, being underestimated is an advantage if you use it correctly. While Richard Hartwell was dismissing me, I was learning and building and improving. By the time he noticed I was a threat, it was too late. Second, the best revenge isn't emotional or vindictive, it's strategic and patient. I didn't succeed to hurt Richard. I succeeded to prove to myself that I could, and his humiliation was just a byproduct of my success. Third, Never let someone else's limited imagination define your possibilities. Richard couldn't imagine someone like me succeeding because his worldview was too narrow. I succeeded because I refused to accept his limitations. Thornton Strategic Solutions now has 140 employees across 6 offices. We're on track for $40 million in revenue this year. We've been approached by 2 larger PE firms about a potential exit at a valuation north of $200 million. I'm 28 years old, and I run one of the fastest-growing consulting firms in the Midwest. And every single day, I remember that interview 5 years ago when a man told me I'd never make it. That memory doesn't hurt anymore. It just reminds me how far I've come. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments, because I love hearing where this story reaches people who refuse to let others define their limits.